Something wild happened to me recently, and I still can't believe how crazy it all turned out. Imagine waking up one day to find all your cars gone. Not just a few, but every single one of them vanished without a word. And the worst part? The people who took them didn't even realize that I owned the towing company they used. Yes, you heard that right. The HOA, the very group in charge of enforcing the neighborhood rules, literally stole all my cars. And somehow, they had no clue who they were messing with. Let me back up a bit so you can understand how this mess started. If you're not familiar with HOAs, they're basically organizations set up to manage neighborhoods, especially in gated communities or apartment complexes. They make the rules about parking, noise, property appearance, and all that. Most of the time, people think HOAs are just annoying rule enforcers, but I never imagined they could go as far as taking everything I own. But that's exactly what happened. I've always been a car guy. Cars aren't just vehicles to me, they're a passion, a hobby, and honestly, a part of my identity. Over the years, I collected quite a few of them, from classic muscle cars to newer sports models. It's not just about driving, it's about taking care of each one, restoring parts, making sure they run perfectly. So having all of them taken away, you can imagine how heartbroken and furious I was. The neighborhood I live in is controlled by a strict HOA. They have rules about where you can park, how long your car can stay on the street, and even what kinds of vehicles you're allowed to keep outside. I always thought I was following the rules carefully, but apparently, the HOA didn't see it that way. One day, I started getting notices about parking violations, and honestly, I brushed them off at first. I thought, okay, I'll move some cars around, no big deal. But things quickly escalated. It started with one car being towed. I got a call from the towing company, saying they had picked it up on behalf of the HOA. That was frustrating, but I figured I could get it back and be done with it. But then, more cars disappeared. And not just randomly, the HOA was systematically towing every car I had parked around the property. I wasn't given much warning. The notices weren't clear, and the HOA board wasn't answering my questions. Now here's where the story gets unbelievable. I own a towing company. Yes, that's right. I run the business that provides towing services in our area, including the company the HOA uses when they need to remove vehicles. 4 years, I've managed this company, overseeing everything from operations to customer service. It's a side business I built up from scratch, and it's something I'm proud of. So imagine my shock when I found out that the HOA had hired my own towing company to tow my cars without realizing I was the owner. They were literally paying me to take away my own vehicles. It felt like something out of a bad movie or a strange prank. But it wasn't. This was happening in real life, in my own neighborhood. At first, I didn't even know what to think. Was this some kind of mistake? Did the HOA just not communicate with my company? How could they not know who they were dealing with? The whole situation felt like a giant misunderstanding on every level. But as I dug deeper, it became clear this wasn't just a mix-up, it was a power play by the HOA. They were determined to enforce their rules, and it didn't matter who got hurt in the process. I kept wondering how this could happen. How does a group of neighbors and community leaders not realize the connection between me and the towing company? How did they manage to make such a costly and unnecessary move? And what were their true motives? Were they just trying to send a message, or did they genuinely want to get rid of my cars? The more I thought about it, the more complicated things got. What made it even more frustrating was the lack of communication. The HOA didn't reach out to me directly. They didn't try to discuss the problem or find a solution. Instead, they quietly hired the towing company and started removing my cars one by one. It felt like they were working behind my back, making decisions that impacted me without my knowledge or consent. And because I owned the towing company, I had access to all the records, contracts, and invoices. I could see exactly when and how the cars were taken. I could trace every step of the process. That gave me a strange mix of power and helplessness at the same time. I knew what was happening, but I couldn't stop it immediately because the HOA had all the paperwork in order, at least on the surface. I started talking to some neighbors, trying to understand if anyone else had faced similar problems. Surprisingly, a few people admitted they had been frustrated with the HOA's strict rules too, but no one expected something as extreme as this. It was a shock to the whole community when they found out the HOA had gone this far. The more I share this story, the more people seem to relate. HOA struggles are common, but this twist where the HOA unknowingly hires your own company to take your property, that's almost unheard of. It's a story about misunderstanding, power, and a clash between authority and individual rights. Before all this chaos, I never really thought much about the HOA. Like most people, I assumed they were just there to keep things organized and make sure the neighborhood looked nice. I knew they had rules about parking, noise, and property upkeep, but I always figured those were just minor annoyances you deal with when living in a community like this. I didn't expect that they could cause so much trouble or go after my cars the way they did. Living in an HOA community means following their guidelines, even if sometimes they feel strict. I tried my best to stay on their good side, but the parking situation was tricky. I own several cars, and with limited space, it's hard to keep them all neatly parked according to the rules. I thought I was doing everything right, parking in allowed areas, moving cars when necessary. But the HOA seemed to have a problem with that. One thing that became clear early on was that the HOA was very serious about enforcing their parking rules. They didn't just send warnings or notices, they acted quickly. When they decided a car was in violation, they moved fast to get it towed. No grace period, no real conversation. It felt like they were more interested in power and control than actually working with residents. I remember the first time I got a notice about a parking violation. It was confusing because I thought my car was parked legally. When I asked the HOA for clarification, they gave vague answers. I tried to explain my situation, but it felt like they weren't really listening. Then, out of nowhere, that first car was gone. I called the towing company and was shocked to find out they had already taken it. At that moment, I didn't know yet that the towing company was mine. I was just upset and worried. How could they take my car without a proper warning? What if I couldn't get it back? I started digging to understand what was happening and how to fix it. Then, cars started disappearing one by one. I wasn't dealing with just one or two, it was the entire collection. I started to feel like I was under attack. It was frustrating because I was being punished without a fair chance to explain or fix anything. And the HOA wasn't making it easy to communicate with them. They seemed to avoid my calls and emails. It was around this time that I discovered the twist: the towing company was mine. When I realized this, I felt a mix of disbelief, anger, and confusion. How could the HOA not know this? How could they use my own company to take my property? I couldn't believe it. It was like a bad joke. Owning the towing company means I usually handle disputes calmly and professionally. I've worked hard to build a reputation of fairness and good service. So finding out that my own company was being used in a way that hurt me personally felt like a betrayal. After the shock wore off, I started looking into the contracts between the HOA and my company. I wanted to know if there was any clause or agreement that allowed this kind of action without checking with me first. It turned out the HOA had hired the company without ever mentioning or consulting me. They just treated it like any other business deal. This made me realize how little control or information I actually had about what the HOA was doing with my business. Even though I owned the towing company, the HOA made decisions behind the scenes that directly impacted me without my knowledge. It was like I was invisible to them. The more I learned, the more I understood the HOA's mindset. They believed they were enforcing the rules strictly to keep order in the neighborhood. But they didn't see the human side of their actions: how taking someone's property, especially without warning, could cause pain and anger. I started to talk to people in the community to see if others had been treated unfairly. Some neighbors shared stories about being fined or having their cars towed for minor infractions. It seemed the HOA was focused on control, not on building a positive community. At the same time, I had to think about how to respond. I owned the towing company, but I couldn't just call the shots to stop the HOA. I had to work within legal boundaries and respect the contracts in place. It was complicated because on one hand, I wanted to protect my property, but on the other, I needed to maintain professionalism with my business. This situation became a balancing act, protecting my rights as a homeowner and car owner, while also managing my role as a business owner providing services to the HOA. I had to find a way to deal with both without making things worse. I started gathering evidence, documenting every interaction, every car that was towed, and every notice from the HOA. I wanted to build a clear picture of what was happening in case I needed to take legal action or negotiate with them. At the same time, I couldn't help but feel frustrated by the lack of respect and communication. The HOA acted like I was an enemy, not a neighbor or a business partner. It made me question how these organizations operate and how much power they should have. I also realized how important it is for residents to know their rights and to stay informed about what's happening in their communities. The HOA had rules and power, but that doesn't mean they can act without accountability. This whole experience opened my eyes to the complexities of living in an HOA community and the potential conflicts that can arise. It also showed me how important it is to stand up for yourself, even when the odds feel stacked against you. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed, wondering if I could ever get my cars back or resolve the conflict peacefully. But I knew I had to keep fighting, not just for myself, but to send a message that this kind of treatment isn't acceptable. As the story unfolded, I started planning my next steps, thinking carefully about how to confront the HOA and protect my interests. But that part of the story is something I'll share next. After realizing the full scale of what was happening, I knew I had to act fast. This wasn't just about a few cars being towed, it was about standing up to an HOA that was abusing its power, and protecting my property and my business. But where to start? The situation was complicated, especially since the HOA didn't know I owned the towing company, and I couldn't just stop the process overnight without causing more problems. The first thing I did was reach out to the HOA board directly. I wanted to have a conversation, lay everything out on the table, and try to understand their side. I figured maybe this was all just a big misunderstanding, maybe they really didn't know who I was, and once they did, things could be sorted out. So, I sent them a formal letter explaining the situation, emphasizing that I own the towing company and asking them to pause any further towing of my vehicles. To my surprise, the response was cold and dismissive. They acknowledged the letter but didn't offer any apology or indication that they would stop their actions. It felt like they were determined to push their agenda no matter what. That response made me realize this wasn't just about rules, it was personal. The HOA wanted to make a statement, and I was at the center of it. Not willing to back down, I decided to dig deeper into the HOA's bylaws and contracts. I wanted to know exactly what authority they had to tow vehicles, and if they had followed proper procedures. That research uncovered some gaps in their process. For example, the notices they sent out didn't always meet legal requirements, and in some cases, they hadn't properly informed me before towing the cars. With this information in hand, I reached out to a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes. It was a big step for me because I wanted to handle things professionally and make sure I knew my rights. The lawyer helped me understand the legal angles, including what the HOA could and couldn't do. One thing was clear, the HOA had overstepped in many ways. Meanwhile, I continued to manage the towing company as best I could. It was strange running the business that was now involved in a personal conflict. My employees were caught in the middle too, they followed orders from the HOA without knowing the full story. I had to make sure they stayed neutral and professional, while I dealt with the bigger issue. One of the biggest challenges was balancing my emotions. I was angry and frustrated anyone would be if their property was being taken without a fair process. But I also had to stay calm and strategic. Acting impulsively could have made things worse for me, especially with the HOA watching closely. Around this time, I also started talking more openly with neighbors and other community members. I discovered that many people had mixed feelings about the HOA. Some supported their strict enforcement of rules, believing it kept the neighborhood nice. Others were tired of the heavy-handed tactics and the lack of communication. It seemed my situation was just the tip of the iceberg. I realized I wasn't alone in feeling powerless against the HOA. That gave me a sense of purpose. If I could stand up and challenge this, maybe it would encourage others to speak out too. I wanted to show that residents don't have to accept unfair treatment silently. As the dispute escalated, I began to negotiate with the HOA through my lawyer. We proposed a meeting to discuss how to resolve the situation without dragging it through the courts. The goal was to find common ground and avoid further damage to the community and my business. To prepare for this meeting, I gathered all the evidence: emails, notices, towing invoices, contracts, and records from my towing company. I wanted to present a clear case showing how the HOA had acted improperly and how their actions had hurt me. Being organized was key to making a strong argument. When the day of the meeting arrived, it was tense. The HOA board members came prepared to defend their actions, insisting they were within their rights. But I was ready too. I calmly explained my position, revealed the ownership of the towing company, and pointed out the flaws in their process. I made it clear that I wasn't trying to cause trouble but wanted fairness and respect. The conversation didn't immediately solve everything. Some board members were stubborn, unwilling to admit mistakes. But others seemed to understand that the situation had gotten out of hand. Slowly, a discussion about better communication and clearer rules began to take shape. During the meeting, I also stressed the importance of transparency. I suggested that the HOA inform residents more clearly about rules and penalties, and that they work with property owners before taking drastic actions like towing cars. It was about building trust, not just enforcing rules. While negotiations were ongoing, I took steps to recover my cars. Some were still in impound lots managed by my towing company, which made the process a bit easier. I arranged for the release of vehicles and made sure the owners, including myself, could get their cars back without unnecessary fees. The whole experience taught me a lot about power dynamics in communities. It showed me how easy it is for an HOA to make decisions that affect people's lives deeply and how important it is to hold them accountable. I also learned how important it is to know your rights and have the right support when conflicts arise. What surprised me the most was how disconnected the HOA was from the people they were supposed to serve. Their focus on strict enforcement made them lose sight of fairness and community spirit. This whole ordeal was a reminder that rules are only as good as the people enforcing them. Throughout this process, I kept reminding myself to stay patient. Change doesn't happen overnight, especially when dealing with groups that hold power. But standing up for what's right and refusing to be silenced was worth it. The story didn't end there, though. There were more challenges, unexpected twists, and lessons learned along the way. The fight with the HOA pushed me in ways I didn't expect, and I had to adapt and grow. If you think this sounds intense, wait until you hear what happened next, how things escalated, and the unexpected outcomes that followed. It's a reminder that sometimes, standing your ground means facing obstacles head-on, and you never know where it might lead. Just when I thought things might start calming down, the situation took an unexpected turn. After the meeting with the HOA, I expected at least some respect or understanding, but instead, tensions seemed to rise. The HOA board began pushing back harder, almost like they felt challenged by me and wanted to prove a point. Suddenly, it wasn't just about my cars anymore, it felt like a full-on battle for control. I noticed the HOA started targeting other residents more aggressively too. Suddenly, towing became routine for minor infractions, and fines piled up faster than ever. It was as if they wanted to send a message to anyone who dared question them. That raised a lot of concern in the neighborhood, and whispers started spreading among the residents. Meanwhile, I was still dealing with the fallout from my own situation. Having my cars towed and held hostage, even when I owned the towing company, was surreal. I kept getting calls from friends and customers who heard about the story and couldn't believe what was happening. Some even joked that it was like a bad sitcom, but for me, it was very real and stressful. One of the hardest parts was feeling powerless despite owning the towing company. The contracts were set, and the HOA was the client. They had the authority to order tows as long as they followed the rules. I couldn't just say, "Hey, stop towing my cars," without going through proper legal channels. That was a tough pill to swallow. I started looking for ways to change that dynamic. If the HOA wanted to be strict and enforce rules, fine, but I wanted fairness. I knew that meant getting involved more deeply in the community and maybe even the HOA itself. After all, if I was going to protect my rights and those of my neighbors, I needed a voice in the decision-making process. So, I decided to run for a spot on the HOA board. It wasn't an easy decision. I knew it would mean dealing with the politics, personalities, and endless meetings. But I also saw it as the only way to bring some balance and fairness back to the neighborhood. Campaigning was an eye-opening experience. I talked to dozens of neighbors who shared stories of frustration and feeling ignored. Many didn't know their rights or how the HOA operated. I realized there was a real need for transparency and communication. People wanted rules, but they wanted rules that made sense and were enforced fairly. Some of the current board members didn't like the idea of me joining. They saw me as a threat. I faced resistance, rumors, and even some hostility. But there were also plenty of supporters who wanted change. It became clear that this was bigger than just my cars, it was about the whole community. While I was running for the board, I also started hosting informal neighborhood meetings. These weren't official HOA gatherings but casual get-togethers where residents could share concerns, ask questions, and support each other. It was a way to build community and push back against the fear and frustration the HOA's actions had caused. At the same time, I kept working with my lawyer to prepare for any legal battles that might come up. The HOA was still towing cars aggressively, and there were ongoing disputes about fees and notices. I had to be ready to protect not just my vehicles but also the rights of other residents caught in the same situation. The tension between me and the HOA board escalated further when they tried to change some rules quietly to make towing and fines even easier for them. They held a meeting with little notice and pushed through new policies without much discussion. It felt like a power grab. I made sure to inform the community immediately. I encouraged people to attend the next official meeting and voice their concerns. That meeting turned into one of the most heated gatherings I've ever seen. Residents packed the room, many angry and frustrated. Some board members tried to defend the changes, but the overwhelming response forced them to reconsider. That was a turning point. Suddenly, the HOA had to listen because the community wasn't staying silent anymore. It wasn't just me anymore, it was a group of neighbors standing up for fairness, respect, and transparency. As for my cars, I finally managed to get most of them back after a long process. It wasn't easy or cheap, but it was worth it. The feeling of driving one of my own cars again, after everything that happened, was priceless. It reminded me why I fight for what's right, because it's about more than just vehicles or contracts. It's about respect and dignity. Looking back, this whole experience taught me how important it is to be proactive. If you feel wronged or powerless in your community, don't wait for someone else to fix things. Get involved, speak up, and push for change. That's the only way to make a difference. I also learned how tricky HOA politics can be. They have a lot of power, but with that power comes responsibility. When they forget that, problems arise. The balance between rules and respect is delicate, and when it tips too far one way, people get hurt. Through all this, I kept reminding myself to stay focused and not let frustration take over. It wasn't easy, but patience, persistence, and clear communication made all the difference. Even now, the neighborhood is still healing from the fallout. Some relationships are strained, but there's also a new sense of awareness. People are paying attention, asking questions, and holding the HOA accountable. That's a huge step forward. This story is far from over. There are still battles ahead, but I'm ready for them. I'm ready to keep fighting for fairness, not just for me but for everyone in the community. If you think this sounds intense, wait until you hear what happens next: the surprises, the setbacks, and the moments that tested me the most. Sometimes, standing your ground means facing the unexpected head-on, and that's exactly what happened here. When I thought I was starting to get a handle on things, the drama took a wild turn that no one saw coming. After fighting the HOA for so long, trying to negotiate and bring some order, I was blindsided by a move that completely flipped the script. The board announced that they were planning to switch towing companies, and not just that, but to hire a completely new company that none of us had heard of. This was confusing and suspicious, especially since I owned the current towing company they had been using all along. At first, I thought it might be a trick or a misunderstanding. Why would the HOA suddenly drop my company after all the turmoil? I dug into it and found out the new company was brought in secretly, without any public discussion or input from the community. It felt like a power play to push me out, to cut ties without facing the consequences of what they'd done. This move hurt on a business level, sure, but on a personal level, it was frustrating. I wasn't just some contractor, I was a resident, a neighbor, and someone who had tried to work with the HOA even when they pushed back hard. But now, it felt like I was being punished for standing up for myself. I decided to take a step back and reassess my approach. I couldn't just react emotionally or burn bridges, I had to stay strategic. I focused on two things: protecting my business and protecting my rights as a homeowner. That meant fighting the HOA's decision legally, but also strengthening my position in the neighborhood. I started hosting more neighborhood meetings, inviting residents to talk about the changes, the towing issues, and the broader problems with the HOA. People were hungry for information and wanted to share their own stories. Some talked about getting towed for trivial reasons, others about how fines piled up so quickly they couldn't keep up. The frustration was real and widespread. At these gatherings, I made sure to emphasize the importance of community. We weren't just fighting over cars or contracts, we were fighting for fairness and respect. People started organizing, signing petitions, and preparing to voice their concerns at the next official HOA meeting. Meanwhile, I worked with my lawyer to file a formal objection to the HOA's decision to switch towing companies. The contract with my company was still valid, and the HOA had to follow proper procedures to make any changes. By challenging their move legally, I hoped to buy time and send a clear message that I wouldn't be pushed out quietly. While the legal process was slow, the community pressure started to grow. More neighbors showed up at meetings, more emails were sent to the board demanding transparency. The HOA couldn't ignore the growing unrest. For the first time, the power dynamic was shifting. One evening, after a particularly heated HOA meeting, I was approached by a few board members privately. They admitted that the decision to change towing companies had been rushed and maybe not the best idea. They wanted to reopen discussions and find a way to work things out. It was a small victory, but it showed that persistence pays off. I also got some surprising support from unexpected places. Some longtime residents who had been quiet until then started reaching out. They shared stories of similar conflicts with the HOA from years ago, and how things had only gotten worse. It was clear the problems ran deep, and my fight was just part of a bigger issue. All this made me even more determined to stay involved and push for lasting change. I knew it wouldn't be easy. HOAs often operate behind closed doors, and getting true transparency requires constant pressure. But I believed that a united community could demand better treatment and fairer rules. In the meantime, my towing company kept operating, but I made some changes to how we handled HOA calls. I wanted to be sure my business wasn't used to unfairly target residents anymore. We tightened up our procedures, requiring clearer evidence before towing, and making sure notices were properly documented. It was my way of restoring trust. Looking back, this whole journey was a roller coaster. What started as a fight to get my own cars back turned into a fight for fairness and respect for an entire neighborhood. It was about standing up against abuse of power and proving that even big organizations have to answer to the people they serve. The experience also taught me about resilience. There were moments when I felt exhausted and doubted whether I could win. But giving up wasn't an option, not when so many others were counting on me to keep pushing. Now, with the legal battle still ongoing and the community more engaged than ever, I'm hopeful. The fight isn't over, but it's clear that change is possible when people come together and refuse to stay silent. And honestly, this whole saga has given me a new perspective on what it means to own a business in a community. It's not just about profits or contracts, it's about relationships, responsibility, and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. So, the next time you hear about an HOA dispute or a towing drama, remember, it's often about much more than just cars or fees. It's about power, respect, and the fight to be heard. And sometimes, that fight comes from the most unexpected places. When I thought the worst was behind me, the story took a completely new twist, one that caught me totally off guard. After all the back and forth with the HOA and the surprise attempt to replace my towing company, Things seemed to be settling. But then I got a call that changed everything. Someone tipped me off that the HOA was secretly planning to raise monthly fees for every homeowner, with barely any notice or explanation. I couldn't believe it. After all the drama with towing, fines, and rules, they were now trying to sneak in a hefty fee increase on top of everything else. I knew this would hit a lot of people hard. Some neighbors were already struggling to keep up with the fines from the towing mess. The first thing I did was share the news with the community. I sent out messages, posted in neighborhood groups, and invited everyone to a special meeting to discuss what was going on. The turnout was huge. It felt like the whole neighborhood had been holding their breath, waiting for a chance to push back. At that meeting, emotions ran high. People were angry, frustrated, and scared. Some talked about how the fees would force them to move or make tough sacrifices. Others shared stories about how the HOA's heavy-handed tactics had already taken a toll on their lives. Listening to those stories made me realize this wasn't just about rules or cars anymore, it was about people's homes, their peace of mind, and their futures. That night, the community decided to take a stand. We drafted a letter demanding the HOA board provide a clear explanation for the fee hike and hold a transparent vote with all residents involved. It was important to show that we weren't going to be blindsided or ignored any longer. The HOA didn't respond right away. 4 days, there was silence. That only made people more anxious and determined to keep pushing. We organized more meetings, shared information, and encouraged residents to attend the next official HOA board meeting. When the meeting finally came, it was packed. More people showed up than ever before. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. The board presented their case for the fee increase, claiming it was necessary for neighborhood maintenance and security. But many residents weren't convinced, especially since the timing felt suspicious and the lack of communication was frustrating. I spoke up during the meeting. I reminded everyone about the towing controversy, the rushed decisions, and the lack of transparency that had caused so much trouble. I told them that we deserved better, that we deserved honesty and respect. That resonated with a lot of people in the room. Several board members seemed uneasy. Some even admitted that communication had been poor and promised to do better. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The vote to approve the fee hike was delayed, giving the community more time to review and discuss. After the meeting, I realized how powerful it was for residents to come together. We weren't just neighbors anymore, we were a united community demanding fairness and respect. That feeling gave me renewed energy to keep fighting. Around this time, I also dug deeper into how the HOA managed finances. I reviewed budgets, spending reports, and contracts. What I found was eye-opening. There were expenses that didn't make sense, questionable payments, and little accountability. It raised more questions about where all our money was really going. I shared those findings with some trusted neighbors and encouraged them to demand a financial audit. Transparency wasn't just about rules and fees, it was about making sure our community was managed responsibly. The push for an audit gained momentum fast. More residents signed petitions, asked questions, and showed up at meetings. The board couldn't ignore us anymore. As the pressure grew, the HOA finally agreed to bring in an independent auditor. That decision was a huge win, but it also meant more battles ahead. We didn't know what the audit would uncover or how the board would respond. Meanwhile, my own situation with the towing company and the HOA continued to be complicated. Even with all the legal steps and community support, there were moments when I felt drained. Balancing the fight against the HOA, running my business, and dealing with personal life was exhausting. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered why I started this fight in the first place. It wasn't just about me or my cars, it was about making sure no one else had to go through what I did. It was about standing up for fairness and respect in a place we all call home. That's when I realized something else important. Change doesn't happen just by confronting those in power. It happens by building something new, by creating a community that listens, supports, and fights together. So, I doubled down on building connections with neighbors, sharing information, and helping people understand their rights. We started workshops about how HOAs work, how to read contracts, and how to protect yourself legally. Knowledge became a weapon against the fear and confusion that the HOA tried to use. The story kept evolving, with new twists and surprises at every turn. But through it all, the community grew stronger. We learned that when people stand up and speak out, they can't be ignored. And no matter what happens next, that's a lesson I'll carry with me forever. After the audit was announced, things started to shift in the neighborhood. Suddenly, the HOA board wasn't so sure they could push through decisions without scrutiny. The idea that an independent auditor would comb through their books made some of them uneasy. For the rest of us, it felt like a long overdue step toward accountability. But the process wasn't quick or easy. Weeks turned into months as the auditors dug through financial records, contracts, and expense reports. Residents kept the pressure on, attending meetings and asking for updates. Some board members started to change their tone, more cautious now, knowing their actions were under the microscope. During this time, I kept focusing on my role not just as a towing company owner, but as a community advocate. I realized that while the audit was a powerful tool, real change required more than just numbers on paper. It needed people to stay engaged, to demand better communication, and to hold the board accountable for their decisions every step of the way. One thing became clear: many people didn't understand the HOA's rules or how the organization worked. So I started putting together simple guides and FAQs about HOA governance, budgets, and homeowner rights. The goal was to empower residents with knowledge so they wouldn't feel helpless or confused when decisions affected their lives. These guides were a hit. Neighbors began sharing them, asking questions, and organizing small groups to discuss their concerns. It was amazing to see how quickly the community's energy shifted from frustration to action. At the same time, some residents began stepping up to run for the HOA board themselves. They wanted to bring fresh perspectives and ensure that decisions were made with the community's best interest in mind. I supported these efforts wholeheartedly because I knew that lasting change came from within. Of course, not everyone was on board with these changes. Some board members resisted openly, trying to delay the audit or discredit residents who spoke up. They held secret meetings and sent out confusing messages designed to divide the community. It was frustrating, but it also made our cause stronger. The unity among residents grew tighter as a result. We knew that to fight back against such tactics, we had to stick together and keep pushing for transparency. Meanwhile, the audit finally released its preliminary findings. The report highlighted several issues: questionable spending on unnecessary projects, lack of clear documentation for some expenses, and poor financial management. It wasn't a full scandal, but it confirmed many of the concerns we had raised. This report became a powerful tool. We used it to demand changes in how the HOA handled finances, including better reporting, clearer budgeting, and regular community updates. The board was forced to take these demands seriously, especially with so many residents watching closely. With this momentum, I also revisited my own fight with the towing company contract. The HOA had to acknowledge that their actions toward me were unfair and that proper procedures needed to be followed if they wanted to change contractors. They began working with me again, at least temporarily, while they figured out a long-term plan. That gave me some relief but also motivation to keep advocating for fair treatment, not just for myself, but for every resident who had been caught in confusing and unfair towing situations. I also started working with local legal aid groups and tenant advocacy organizations. I wanted to connect neighbors with resources to help them understand their rights and fight back if necessary. The more people who knew their options, the harder it became for the HOA to operate without accountability. What surprised me most was how this whole ordeal sparked new friendships and alliances in the neighborhood. People who barely said hello before were now working side by side, united by a shared goal. It was a reminder that community isn't just about shared spaces, it's about shared struggles and support. Despite the progress, I knew this was just the beginning. The audit report wasn't the end of the fight, it was a wake-up call. There would be more battles over rules, fees, and management decisions. The HOA might try to push back again or make new moves without consulting residents. But the difference now was that we were ready. We had built a network of informed, engaged residents who wouldn't let things slide. We had started to change the culture of our neighborhood from one of fear and silence to one of empowerment and action. Even the younger families who hadn't been involved before started paying attention. They asked questions at meetings, shared posts on social media, and brought fresh energy to the cause. It felt like a movement, not just a complaint about towing or fees, but a genuine effort to create a better community for everyone. And through it all, I kept reminding myself why I fought so hard in the first place. It wasn't about winning against the HOA board or protecting my towing company. It was about standing up for fairness, respect, and a community where people felt heard and valued. Sometimes, I still think about how strange it all started, with those cars being towed and the frustration that came with it. But looking back, that moment was the spark that lit a much bigger fire, one that continues to grow. The fight isn't over, but now it's a fight we're facing together. And that makes all the difference.